Time for a quick ad break. Beyond Solitaire is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, and they are launching their Kickstarter campaign for 500-Year-Old Vampire at the end of March. Designer Jason Cox has adapted Tim Hutchings' solo RPG design to create a cooperative experience that can either be played among friends or as a creative exercise in classrooms. In fact, it is written to satisfy national English and art standards. This one is going to be good, so I recommend you check it out. I also want to put in a quick plug for myself. I absolutely love working on Beyond Solitaire, and I wish I had more time to put into it. You can help me make that possible by giving to my Patreon at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. My ultimate goal is to get to a point where I no longer have to teach summer school, so I can budget my time for game work and summer conventions instead. But no matter what, thanks for listening, and let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today on the pod I have a very special guest. This is Dr. Kate Cook. She is Associate Lecturer in Classics at the University of St. Andrews. How you doing today, Kate?
I'm great, thanks.
Hey, it's wonderful to have you on, and I've asked you on because you do two things that I find very interesting. You study classics, and you play a lot of video games. So why don't you tell us kind of your academic background and how you've gotten to where you are a games researcher?
Yeah, sure. I've always played video games, I should say. And one of the kind of things that almost cued me into the fact that probably I should study classics rather than, say, history at university was that I spent a lot of my time when I was supposed to be revising for my history exams playing the old city builder, Zeus, Master of Olympus. I mean, doing other things as well, doing Latin revision and so on. But I was kind of repeatedly coming back to this, to the ancient world, to the sort of myths and to games exploiting them. And that sort of made me realize quite how interested I was in the ancient world. And so then I went and kind of did study, and my first kind of background in classics, my first research interest is actually Greek drama. And it's only over the last couple of years that I've diversified a little bit and picked up this kind of games interest, which has always been running alongside as a kind of personal capacity. It's something I've done for fun, but which then became part of my research as well in the last few years.
Oh, that's awesome. So, when you were doing Greek drama, who was your favorite author? Like, what were you interested in before you made this metamorphosis? I'm always interested in these things.
Um, Probably all three of them. I work specifically on Greek tragedy, and I'm interested in kind of tracing patterns across the genre or through the genre. So my PhD project and what will be my first book with Bloomsbury, which should hopefully be out, I would have thought next year, is on kind of praise and blame in Greek tragedy as a whole. So looking at what characters say about each other rather than what they do necessarily. But another kind of very strong research interest has always been gender. So I'm particularly interested in what sort of female characters say about male characters in the praise and blame sphere, and also at looking more broadly at women in Greek tragedy. And that sort of gender strand is actually, of course, an interest that has come across with me into the games research as well. So looking at women and looking at gender is kind of a strong interest for me across all three tragedians.
Awesome. And, we were just talking before this. At the time that I was finishing my PhD, video game studies was not a thing the way that it is now. What tipped you off to the idea that maybe your study of classical women could apply to video game reception studies as well?
I mean, I think kind of the field of classical reception studies has, as we were just saying, has been kind of growing in the last few years and has started to encompass a really wide range of things as well. So there's always been interest in, things like almost what some people call high culture. I hate that as a label, but things like, theatre and opera and so on, and how they engage with the classics. But more recently, there's been a lot more kind of serious engagement by scholars with things like film and TV as well. And games games is a kind of mass media industry alongside those. I mean, the games industry in the US in the last couple of years has been bigger than the Hollywood industry in terms of both numbers of people engaged in the games and the kind of turnover, the finances of the industry. So if we're thinking kind of multimedia industries and what they're doing with the classics, then games is absolutely a big one up there. And it's also started, it's not just me looking at it either. It's also started to become a bigger topic across classics. So there have been a couple of other books out in the last couple of years that have started looking at this area, and to some extent in other fields too. So the historians are actually slightly ahead of us in this regard. I would say there's kind of historical game studies it's still not a massive field, but it's a bigger field than what you might call classical game studies. And there are certain kind of areas of history like medieval history or modern history are particularly interested in the moment at looking at how their kind of historical periods are presented in games. And that's, as I say, that's another kind of growing area of scholarship. So it has started to become a thing, not just for classicists, but outside in history as well. And as I saw that, I wanted to be part of it, really.
That's awesome. And so you mentioned that your dissertation is going to turn into your first book, but only kind of, because you have an edited volume that's out, and it's one of the things that caught my interest and made me want to talk to you. So you've got Women in Classical Video Games that you co-edited with Jane Draycott. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And so tell us about y'all's book. What was the process of pulling it together? What kinds of essays made it in? And for interested readers, what might they find inside?
Yeah, sure. So, actually, this book was in some ways a response to the fact that this field has suddenly started appearing in classics. Because, as I mentioned, we had these books, the first of which was another edited volume on antiquity in video games, and both Jane and I were interested in this. We'd both sort of been separately looking at games a little bit by ourselves, and one of the things that struck us about this volume was that it didn't seem to be engaging with the issue of gender very much. It had one chapter out of about 15 on women, and we both felt that that wasn't really enough. So it was important to us that the question of gender and the kind of question of women should become a topic that was being raised at the very start of this new field, right? We're looking at classics in video games, and we didn't want it to be like looking at kind of classics more broadly, where we do men for 1,500 years, and then someone says, oh, well, maybe let's study women now. We wanted women to be in there and gender to be in there from the beginning. So it was really important to us to get this book out, to get this book to be part of the conversation right from the start, so that people were not sidelining these issues of gender, particularly because in games, questions of representation and questions of gender and kind of and in the games industry is a really big deal as well. So we decided to put out a call for papers, and actually this happened kind of during the pandemic, so we didn't have a conference or anything like that. We went straight into putting the book together, and we were really lucky. We had a huge amount of interest. We got something like 50 or 60 abstracts, which is far more than we could put into a volume, and some of them were not on classics. So Jane actually took some of the ones that were on sort of history more broadly away and made those into a separate volume, and we kind of gathered the classical ones together and selected the ones we want. And for us, it was really important. There were a couple of things that were really important. Firstly, we wanted to make sure that we were getting kind of decent diversity of voices. So early career scholars and kind of people who maybe hadn't written on this material before. I mean, not many people have written on this material before, but it was important to us to get kind of some of those voices that we weren't necessarily hearing elsewhere into the volume. And it was also really important to us to have a decent amount of variety as well, because there are kind of some games and some topics that come up quite a lot in the field. So there tends to be quite a lot of discussion of strategy games, for example, because these make a lot of use of historical content. They're kind of very popular. Sometimes the kind of action RPGs, so Assassin's Creed, get a lot of discussion. But it was important to us to try and look more broadly. And actually, what you asked me about tragedy, and when I said I like to look at kind of all the tragedians, it's probably coming in here again, actually, because we wanted to look at all types of of games in the same kind of way. We wanted to think about games as broadly as possible. So we've looked at a really wide range of genres. We were really lucky that we had the kind of contributors willing to do that. So indie games are in there as well as the strategy games. I looked at a mobile game. We have got some action RPG. We've got a modern platformer. We've got one chapter on Japanese games, early Japanese games, and the interaction with the character of Athena by Dunstan Lowe. So really trying to get a kind of very broad range of different representations of women's, different kind of settings, different genres of game, to see whether we could find kind of patterns or trends if you cast the net more broadly than some of the sort of more typical games that people often discuss. So that was kind of a big driving selection process for us.
So I had a couple of questions about how books and articles like this come together. And one is, what does your research process look like? How do you select what games to play? And then how do you decide what you need to kind of pair with that in terms of engaging with the historical record? Like, it's just a totally different process than, what did this ancient author think about X thing, where you just look at them and their context.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. So I think in some ways, a lot of what I'm doing, certainly, I mean, I can only speak to my own research process, really. Other authors may take different approaches, but when I'm researching a game, a lot of what I'm doing is very similar to when I'm researching a tragedy, except it takes a lot longer because it doesn't normally take 90 hours to read a tragedy, whereas it may well take me 90 hours to play through a game. And that's something I didn't actually really appreciate before I started doing this research, quite how time consuming it could be. But so what I will normally do is if it's a game that I'm sort of playing for research, I think it's quite important personally to play them. Not everyone does. Some people look at kind of videos and so on. But for me, it's important to have control of the process and be able to kind of guide to the right sort of scenes or the right conversations, which obviously you can't do if you're just watching someone else play it. So I will play through and I will take normally hundreds of screenshots is really kind of a key aspect. So I will play through every scene. Sometimes I will have to play through scenes multiple times. So the mobile game that I played for my chapter in this volume, I played at least I think 9 times in full in order to get kind of all of the different options in all of the different scenes and find out what all of the kind of permutations of dialogue could be. Take a lot of screenshots to have a record of that. So then when I kind of get to writing the chapter or the article, I've got that at hand and I can go back through and check the dialogue and kind of check all the, as it were, the evidence base. And just sort of go from there. And that's, as I say, that's a lot like reading through a primary text, really. I mean, it's more interactive, there's more of the kind of play aspect, but in terms of getting all of the information and then kind of pulling out the key examples that are relevant for my argument, the process is quite similar, just bigger.
That makes sense. And then, how do you cast your net for games that will be relevant to research like this? So something like Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Origins seems, pretty obvious because it's a big blockbuster game. But, mobile games came up in your volume and, things other than just Total War came up in your volume. So how, some visual novels I noticed as well. So how are you hunting for these? Do they just kind of fall in your lap? Do you go on Steam and just type mythology and see what happens? A mix? I've always just kind of wondered about this.
Yeah, so probably a mix. So the mobile game, which is kind of chapter based, almost like a kind of visual novel that I wrote on for this book, appeared weirdly in Facebook ads for me at the very start of the pandemic. So originally I was going to write my chapter in this volume on something else. But this game and it started spamming a lot of people on Facebook during the pandemic. And I sort of picked it up and noticed that it had this Roman story. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll just, I'll see what it is. I have no idea what this game is. I'll kind of follow it and see what happens. And there was a lot of really interesting things going on in it. So I thought, well, actually, this could be, something we should be paying more attention to. And I'm lucky that it's just showed up for me through random ads, but a lot of people are missing it. So this is a good chance for me to highlight it. Sometimes it is about literally casting the net as wide as possible. So I've written elsewhere recently on the blog for Peisterman, which is a database that collects ancient world video games. They run a blog, and I've recently written for them on kind of mobile games more broadly that interact with the ancient world. And a lot of collecting examples for that was literally just searching, Rome or Greece or ancient or absolutely mythology or whatever, and just going through pages and pages of search results and downloading anything that looked relevant and giving it a go. That's obviously for when I'm trying to, gather samples across a broader range. Or I'm writing at the moment a chapter on Persephone in modern video games, and that's been a similar kind of some of the big examples. Again, the things like the fact that she features in an Assassin's Creed DLC. It's a major blockbuster game, so it's very easy to find that out. Finding rarer examples has very much been a case of just sort of searching Persephone in all of these tools to find other examples, and sometimes that gives you stuff that's useful, and sometimes it gives you stuff which has the name Persephone in for no apparent reason and doesn't have anything to do with Persephone, which is interesting in a different way. Um, and I'm also lucky that places like Twitter are a really good resource for this. One of the advantages, I think, of historical game studies and classical game studies being so new is that a lot of the people involved are quite young, and they're all on Twitter, and they do things like share games with each other. So when interesting mobile games come up now, there's normally people around who will point me to them and say, "Hey, have you seen this? You should include this in the next thing you're looking at," and so on. And that's been really good. So the community of other people working on this, although we're quite small, I think is really good about sharing resources with each other, which is very helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah, Twitter has its drawbacks, but I would say that in board game world too, like Twitter's just it's amazing the connections you manage to make with people almost in spite of the platform sometimes.
Yes.
So the other question I had, and I think we could probably go pretty far with this discussion, is what kinds of historical expectations can we place on video games, especially those that are not necessarily holding themselves to any particular or any consistent set of standards? And then how does that actually impact your reception work?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question, really, because I think obviously video games, games of any kind, are not setting out to be, as it were, almost historical documents or historical textbooks or anything like that. They're designed for entertainment, and they're also designed with a kind of clear commercial process involved, which is they are designed to sell, and that is going to have a huge impact on the kind of content they are producing. And I think it would be I'm not very interested in doing the kind of work that is just sort of looking at these games and saying, well, here's a historical inaccuracy and here's a historical inaccuracy. I mean, of course, we will find plenty of those, but we should expect to find plenty of those because that isn't what games are aiming at. In historical game studies, one of the things that has kind of become a big topic over the last 10 years or so is the difference between accuracy and authenticity. And interestingly, while game players often don't really distinguish between the two, game developers have recently started talking quite clearly about authenticity as opposed to accuracy, by which they mean they're actually not even interested in talking about kind of specific facts, but they are interested in portraying a sort of sense of the period, and they label that as authenticity. So if it feels to a player like a kind of classical Greece, then it's authentic, even though it may simultaneously not be very accurate. If you see what I mean. Does that distinction make
Yeah, so
sense? Yeah,
basically it's
okay,
like
good.
vibes versus details.
A little bit, yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, as I say, developers think of this as kind of a fairly clear distinction in their minds, but players often don't. Players will talk about accuracy as meaning both, really. Um,
Mhm.
so authenticity has become this kind of big thing, and that's something you can look at. You could talk about, what makes something seem authentic, authentically classical Greece, for example. What do we mean when we talk about that? What kind of things are developers aiming at, and why? Um, and the choices that are made around that, I think, are perfectly interesting and perfectly useful for doing reception work. But also because of, I think, particularly because of my work on gender, sometimes I'm not even particularly interested in authenticity. I'm interested in kind of what kinds of narratives are games telling about the ancient world or about women in the ancient world. And for me, that's not really about, is it accurate? Is it kind of historically accurate? But what ideas about women in the ancient world are these games suggesting we as kind of modern developers and modern players, and how are they kind of reproducing old narratives, or how are they trying to strike away and make new narratives, and all of that kind of thing, which I think often, personally, I think is often much more fruitful as a way of looking at these things, because I think, um, even though games have started to move more into the educational sphere with things like the discovery tours on the Assassin's Creed games, they're clearly not aiming at being, historically accurate educational resources. And to try and hold them to those kind of standards is I mean, it's unfair as well as being kind of pointless, really.
At the same time, I mean, I'm asking these questions because I kind of see, and in your answers, I see things sort of coming together in a way that makes it all connect. So, yes, we can't hold video games to actual historical standards, but sometimes we say we do. And also, even, in this language about authenticity, right? The question is authentic to whom? Authentic in what way? Because it doesn't sound like authenticity actually means this feels like actually being in ancient Rome. Authenticity means like feeling I'm on a tour of the ancient world and this feels sufficiently classical enough to satisfy me. And then those things all kind of explode. Like in the intro to your book, you mentioned having the Amazons as, a faction in a game about Troy. They're warrior women. And something about that, even though it's perfectly authentic to the sources, broke the feeling of authenticity for some of the players of that game. And so, all of these things are in play in these kind of weirdly flexible ways. So, I mean, I would actually like you to talk more about that, about the Amazon issue, and then what does that say about authenticity and about historicity and about claims to authenticity? In one, it's just such a clean example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're kind of framing it as authenticity to whom is exactly right, because there's no kind of blank objective standard against which these games are being held when they have these kind of ideas of authenticity. And often what we're really talking about is players' perceptions of the ancient world, as being the kind of standard which they then set. So the Amazons is a really interesting example, because this was from Troy, and actually kind of comes on the back of, what is sometimes called the female general controversy of, Total War Rome 2, where they had increased numbers of female generals. The generals already existed; they just amped up the kind of spawn rates of these, the chances that you'd end up playing with one. And there was a huge outcry of objections that this was not historically accurate, that it was, attempts at being politically correct and this kind of thing. And Creative Assembly, the company, said, we don't care effectively about this backlash. We're going to carry on keeping the female generals in there. And so then when they brought out the Troy game, they kind of carried on this pattern of, keeping women to some extent in there. They were downloadable content, but they were downloadable content that you got, free if you pre-ordered the game. So for many players, they were kind of, certainly many, interested in advanced players. They were, effectively like base game content. And it was two Amazon factions with two different leaders, Hippolyta and Penthesilea. And they have kind of different play styles, which are kind of nice and interesting. They come in sort of on the Trojan side, except sort of not really, because they are also quite independent. They can, you can play them slightly differently, and they're not that fully tied to the Trojans. And they add some exciting variety, and Creative Assembly produced some beautiful concept art for them as well, which, some of which you can see on the cover of our book, because we liked it so much and we like these Amazons so much. But for some players, this was still really objectionable, and people in particular claimed that they were, again, not historically accurate, and that there was no truth behind the myth. truth behind the myth was a slogan that Creative Assembly had used, had attached to this Troy game, because they had suggested that they were sort of representing it as a kind of truth behind the myth game. This is the kind of historical conflict behind the myths of the Iliad, for example. Although it's very clear that the game is drawing on the epic poems as one of its sort of main sources, because you have the figure of apparently Homer is the person who gives you the tutorial. So this is clearly, these games are based on the epic poems. They're not based on archaeological record or historical documents only, partly because there are no historical documents for any Trojan War. And yet, nonetheless, players found that this wasn't, in their view, accurate, because they were all women armies, and this was felt to be untruthful. That there was no truth behind this myth. This was just kind of mythical. And again, some of them, as is kind of a repeated refrain with some of these complaints, quite a few of them attached this to the idea of being kind of politically correct and being about marketing. This kind of claim of it's not historically accurate to have women is often associated by the people who make these complaints as being a marketing ploy, something to kind of sell the game rather than carrying on their usual approach to representation. So I found this kind of particularly interesting because, I mean, in this game, you can, if you play as Aeneas, you can have him consult with, or talk to dead heroes in the underworld, which is fairly obviously kind of mythological content. There's not much sort of truth behind that. And yet you don't find players complaining about this as being untruthful or inaccurate, but you do find players complaining about the Amazons as being inaccurate. And so that's absolutely, as you say, it feeds into this kind of authentic to whom? Well, to this group of players, it is not authentic to have women involved, even in a mythological context, let alone a historical context. And we see the same thing. I should say, my interest is particularly in gender, but we see the same thing in connection with race in other, particularly in games in other historical contexts. Actually, so one of the things that the medievalists have kind of been bringing out a lot in their analysis recently is medieval games where player perceptions and even developer perceptions, in the case of some games, lead to kind of all white casts, and this is felt to be kind of historically accurate or historically authentic to a certain type of player who believes that it is only historically accurate if everything in medieval Europe is completely white, despite the fact that this is clearly not historically the case. That's their perception, and that's the kind of standard of authenticity they set. So I think, even when we're not talking about accuracy in terms of detail, there are some problematic ideas about historical periods, about the medieval period and about the ancient world, that are creating discourse around some of these ideas of authenticity. Absolutely.
So I noticed some pretty familiar strains throughout the essays in your book. Women as hypersexualized, or, women as not really having distinctly women's experiences in these games. Comments about violence in women that were depressing, but not necessarily shocking. Was there anything in the studies that have emerged so far of women in classical video games that surprised you and that you found exciting?
Um, I'm afraid I'm going to do a surprised me negatively first, but then I'll come on to something I found slightly more exciting.
All right, all right.
Um, I, in some ways, I was surprised, and Jane and I mentioned this very briefly at the end of our introduction. We were surprised and disappointed that despite the huge variety of types of games we tried to include and the kind of very different approaches that our contributors took, we weren't finding a greater range of positive stories. And this is looking at games from relatively early right the way up to now, 2021 and so on, and we're still not getting any more positive stories coming out. There's some attempts in places, particularly in the more independent games, but not as many as we'd hoped. We'd really hoped to be able to say, look at all this positive progress, and we couldn't. And that was surprising to us in some ways, that things hadn't moved further forward than they could have done. But surprised in a more positive sense, or something that excited me, was that you can see, at least in some places, more engagement with questions of gender than used to be. And particularly, I think this comes in the kind of the less mainstream, almost the sort of less moving away from the AAA games. So these are games produced by major or medium-sized studios, into the places where games are being produced in smaller studios or for different audiences. So some of the more independent games like Hades or Apotheon were doing more interesting things with their narratives of gender. They weren't necessarily always doing everything I would like to see, but they were engaging with them. They were trying to create new narratives, trying to kind of discuss some of these issues in more interesting ways. And the area that kind of we've talked about a little bit already, but that particularly surprised and interested me was mobile games, because the type of mobile game that I looked at has as its target audience young women. Particularly kind of older teens, but really they're sort of aiming at young women. And that's despite the fact that women actually make up more than 50% of gamers. It's quite rare, and which is always a kind of surprising number for people, but it's true. It's quite rare for major game studios for sort of consoles or PCs to explicitly say they're aiming at female players. They may say we're aiming at kind of neutral audiences, but the typical gamer is still often assumed to be the kind of young male gamer. And a lot of things like marketing and so on make it very clear that that's the target audience for them. Whoever their real audience is, the target is the young man. But that is explicitly not true for these kind of story-driven mobile games, who are very upfront about the fact that that isn't their target audience. And that means that when you kind of engage with their content, when you have a look at what they're producing, they're often producing really different stories. So the game I looked at, Choices, in their kind of story of the late Republican Roman period, has got a female main character, which is relatively rare, who is surrounded by women as well. There are other men involved in the story, particularly there are men, interestingly, there are men as love interests. So there's some kind of sexualized men appearing, including sometimes appearing, quite naked, for basically a female gaze, which is, quite unusual, really, in this context. But there's a lot of, semi-critical engagement as well with what women's realities in this time period therefore would have been. So you have the opportunity to talk to a character who has experienced forced child marriage, and kind of her experience in this and her difficulty balancing the needs or the wants of her husband and her father, and her kind of growing independence is a key story that intersects with your main character across the game. There are, even just sort of throwaway comments. One female character comments on the fact that if there is going to be civil war, that's going to be additional dangers in the city for the women, which is not going to apply to the men in the same way, and therefore they need to think about it differently. This kind of thing, it comes up because they are trying to think about and engage with women's lives and experiences in a much more explicit way than you might see in the major kind of Assassin's Creed style games. So I thought that was kind of really interesting and really positive, and also suggests a really good reason why we need to be paying attention not just to those big AAA games, because we're going to miss these other interesting narratives that are going on in the kind of smaller or in the mobile type realms.
Yeah, I think one of the weirdest things, especially as a scholar in a field like yours that's growing, right, is that you have a lot of choice about what you choose to spotlight. And then that means that you actually have a surprising amount of power over where the narrative goes and who gets attention and whose stories make it, into the fancy journal as opposed to just somebody's internet forum. And, is that a sense of responsibility that you feel, or is that unrelated to just looking for the kind of classical elements in work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And it kind of cuts both ways, because on the one hand, I mean, yes, we have some element of control over what we discuss. On the other hand, if we had released this book and no one had talked about anything to do with Assassin's Creed, there definitely would have been some people out there saying, well, this game has over 10 million players. Why have you not paid any attention to it? So there very much is a kind of, these sort of big ticket items require some attention. Otherwise, people are surprised and concerned that you seem to have missed something key and important. Um, But I think personally, we also absolutely have a responsibility to try and highlight these other areas of evidence. And I think again, mobile games is a really interesting one, and it's why I've sort of carried on pursuing it a little bit since this volume came out, because mobile games, because they are kind of more casual in many ways than the sort of big ticket AAA games, and um, because of things like microtransactions, which is absolutely, I should say, a really insidious business model. I'm not saying mobile games are brilliant or kind of fantastic and everyone should be playing them. There are clearly problems with them. However, they don't attract very much attention because of these things. These problems have kind of overwhelmed everything else. So they don't get very much journalistic attention. They don't get as much attention in scholarship, but they also have kind of millions of players playing them. And if we kind of follow along with the journalists and we don't pay attention to these because they're sort of getting less attention as it is, then I think we are risking missing what is effectively a large body of evidence that's right there. So I do think we have some responsibility to think about, can we push beyond just the big ticket items, and can we make sure we're looking at the other types of games as well, so that we're not missing anything that could be out there.
Yeah, it also makes me kind of think about a kind of an inadvertent high culture, low culture distinction within like our quote low culture. I really think that we should take games very seriously. I think we should take play seriously, but we like to kind of not treat games as high culture in our society. You're absolutely right, like from your comments earlier. But I also think that the AAA game is like the high culture of video games, and mobile games are, I actually think, looked down upon more. And you know, I also wonder about the interconnections between things like, well, a lot of mobile games do have these kind of romance themes, or they're like visual novels. A lot of them are explicitly directed at women, or they're cute. And, I do wonder, if some of the same things are playing out just in our own modern gaming culture that we're also trying to spot when we're talking about the classical world.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think, particularly the kind of the stereotyping of mobile games as casual and absolutely as played by women means that they're often kind of not taken as seriously, and therefore kind of dismissed in this kind of writing and in other areas. I think, yeah, you're kind of um, the sort of stratification of games as to kind of some which are worth paying attention to and some which aren't absolutely happens. You're dead right, and that does affect the kind of scholarship that is happening, um, and hopefully won't after this. But it's I think something for us all to be aware of as this field grows, and as we start looking at these types of material.
To what extent do you see your work as activism? And then to what extent do you see it as observation? I feel like when you're trying to make a really good academic article, you don't necessarily expect anything to change. You just want to make a really good point about it. But also because you're dealing with very current things that you can impact theoretically in some way. Do you feel a sense of responsibility towards that? Or is that not really the point of your work?
Um, I don't think it's required necessarily. So I'm not. I don't think it's the case that everyone who wants to come and write academic work on these games should be doing activism. But I think certainly from my point of view, I would really like to see this as the beginning of a conversation between kind of us as academics and the people making and playing these games. I think given the numbers involved, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but an Assassin's Creed game has 10 million plus players. Even the mobile games I've mentioned have 1 or 2 million players each. Small games or smaller games sell hundreds of thousands. There are these huge audiences here, and there are these people making games for them. And I think if we can say now, straight away, hey, we're here, we see you doing this thing, this is great, but perhaps there are ways you could be doing it better. I see this story with about this female character. That's a good start, but I think there are some sexist elements. Have you thought about this, or could we talk about this, or even just would you like some ideas of women from the ancient world who you could include in this game who are not Cleopatra, for example? I think if we can start having those conversations and we can make it clear that we are here and ready to take this work seriously as well, because I think. some of the things we've been, you mentioned that people don't always take games seriously, and that's absolutely the case, I think. But those of us writing on these games are taking them seriously as an art form. And I think many of us would be really keen to get involved and kind of speak to developers and say, look, we are not dismissing this material. We think it's great. Can we work together to do things better? And I think certainly that's my perspective on it. I would really like to see books like ours and kind of ongoing work, especially on gender, become part of an ongoing conversation that improves the kind of outputs that we see, the kind of games and the kind of narratives they're telling. That would be my ideal, absolutely. So for me personally, as I said, I don't think everyone necessarily has to, but I would like this to be a kind of a form of activism. I would like to see us changing the conversation through work like this, because there are so many people involved that it seems to me to be too important not to, really.
Nice. And then just one kind of, I guess this is a nerdy question, and then we'll go into, I just want some game recs from you. But so I've been thinking as we talk about this concept of authenticity and what feels authentic to us versus what is authentic and how do we know? Do you I just taught my students about curse tablets this week. Like the ancient world is a really strange place. If you really think, I mean, yes, everybody has some human commonalities, right? Like fart jokes remain funny over thousands of years, or like people care about their children, people love their dogs. Like, we have a lot in common with ancient people just by being people, but also their culture and way of life. Like, if you put us in ancient Rome now as experts, even I don't know that we would do very well. So, would it be even possible to create a video game that feels authentic and to somebody who's a historical expert is without it just turning people off?
I don't know. Um, and I think part of that is about, it's about what is the point of games. I mean, if you were trying to create a game of current day life that was really authentic, I think it would be a really boring game, because we spend a lot of time day to day, doing things which are not entertaining, right? We spend, if we're lucky, 8 hours sleeping, for example. And if your game was going to be really authentic, are you going to make the player sit there for 8 hours doing nothing while the character sleeps? Probably not. Or, if they have to walk down the block to buy a supply, you don't want them to get there and then find that this shop is out, unless there's an exciting plot point behind this shop being out of whatever it is they're trying to buy. So I think, oh, these kind of gameplay requirements mean that even the best kind of created world based on the ancient world couldn't be completely authentic, because that isn't going to be fun. I think there are also aspects as well of kind of the strangeness of the ancient world, which maybe we don't understand well enough to reproduce completely faithfully as well. I mean, there are certainly things that we can, based on the evidence, we can put in some curse tablets and so on. But whether we necessarily truly understand what people in the ancient world were trying to do with these things, such that we can then accurately represent that in a game, maybe not. I don't know. So I think, I think perfection is unlikely, just partly because of the medium and partly just because of our own level of evidence and level of connection with people in the ancient world, that it's bound to be incomplete.
Yes, it's the great tragedy of our work. But, there is still a lot left for us to look at and enjoy, and it sounds like there are a lot of really interesting games out there. So, if you're gonna recommend somebody says, "Okay, this conversation's intrigued me. I wanna go play a game about the ancient world." What are a game or games that you would recommend that offer an interesting experience, if not a fully authentic one?
Um, so I think I've mentioned it briefly before, but I think Hades is a very popular among kind of classical gamers, has been very popular, but for good reason. Hades takes the kind of very obscure myth of Zagreus, the son of Persephone, and Hades himself, and turns it into a roguelite, which is a game where you have to kind of effectively you have to repeatedly die, but you attempt to level, don't get very far, get sent back to the beginning, but get further on the next time. And each kind of iteration gets you a little bit further. And one of the really interesting things about what Hades does with the kind of mythological setting, is that uses these repeat iterations to uncover a little bit more of the myth or a slightly different detail each time. So you have conversations with characters, and the more times you do this, the more the story unfolds in a different way. And so that's doing something really interesting, I think, with the kind of myths that it's set on, that it doesn't give you all of the information straight away, and it allows you to kind of explore these stories, and get different perspectives on these stories the more you play, as well as being a really enjoyable game. So I would definitely put Hades very high up there. There are a whole bunch of very interesting looking city builders coming out, in the Builders of series. There was already Builders of Egypt, but I've just seen they've just announced Builders of Greece as well is coming out this year. I cannot vouch for the whole games yet because they're not out yet, but from what I've seen, for those who really enjoyed the kind of old style city builders, these look like a really good, new, and interesting kind of version, brought up to date, that will be well worth playing. Um, and I think also, I mean, we have mentioned Assassin's Creed a few times, and that's always a kind of standard option. Although personally, I'm not sure I'd recommend it. Particularly given actually the industry context behind that game, makes me very loath to suggest anyone should give them money at the moment. So I'm going to say for my kind of third option, if you'd like a bit of tactical RPG, it's not quite an action RPG, but it's kind of got some tactical play and really interesting story. Expeditions Rome is something I played for work last year and enjoyed a lot more than I thought I would. It puts you male or female, so it has a female protagonist option, which is great. In the position of kind of a young new person, again towards the end of the Republic, joining a legion, and kind of attempting to uncover the dangerous situation behind your father's death. So kind of preserve your family at the same time as advancing through the legions, and kind of going on various conquests, as part of the growing Roman Empire. But the story is interesting. I have colleagues who've complained a lot about the accuracy of this game. As we've already said, I'm not very interested in accuracy. What I do think is interesting is the kind of stories it builds out of this Roman world and the various characters. So I would recommend that one as well. I enjoyed it. I played it much more than I needed to for work, even, which is quite a good kind of sign with these games.
Definitely a good sign. If people have further questions for you or they want to follow your work, where can you be found online?
Probably the easiest place is on Twitter, as long as that stays alive. It maybe give it 6 months, and this announcement will become completely irrelevant. But for the moment, you can still find me on Twitter, if you just look for Kate Cook, or my handle is at CatX, which is KATEXE.
Fantastic. Kate, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and talking to us about your work and your research. It's just really interesting, and I will definitely be taking some of those game recommendations.
Thank you very much for having me, Liz.
All right, everybody out there. Hopefully, by now you know that I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. So please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.